in progress.
Ready? All right. I will call to order the Monday, October 23rd, 2023 Oregon City Planning Commission work session. Commissioner Stoll cannot be with us tonight, Chair Stoll, so I will be filling in. And can we do a roll call, please?
Commissioner LaSalle?
Present.
Commissioner Staggs?
Here.
Commissioner West?
Here.
Commissioner Laws is absent. Commissioner Espy is absent. Vice Chair Schlagenhofer?
Here.
And Chair Stoll, excused absence.
All right, thank you. Normally we don't take public comments, but did anybody virtual ask to make a public comment tonight? All right, okay. First item on the agenda is a discussion item. It's legislative review for the 2023 session. And I believe this is Ms. Carrie Richter.
We're going to present
Perhaps it is also a quote. All right, thank you.
Good evening. So, yes, our Deputy City Attorney, Carrie Richter, and myself, our Quilla Hurd-Ravitch for our millions of viewers out there. We are going to present the 2023 Land Use Legislative Update, and I would just first want to say I appreciate you coming to this work session for this. We gave this update to the City Commission, and I think that it's valuable knowledge. Mostly what we're focusing on are the housing legislative updates, not everything that the legislature accomplished in this last session, but some of it will apply to us, some of it we may have to make code changes for, I'm not sure yet, and some of it we're already kind of complying with. So we will start from there, and let's see. Can you advance it? Doesn't seem to want to, thank you. All right, so that's what we're going to cover tonight is the 2023 land use legislation, and then the city submitted some comments to the governor's housing task force, the governor's office on housing. And so we'll kind of talk about what some of those comments were and how we came up with them and give an update there. And let's see if this is going to work. Okay, oh, it worked. Okay. And I think I'm turning it over to you for these first couple of slides anyway.
Okay.
Does that work?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, so the legislative session last year was a barn burner for a lot of reasons. One was that the Republicans walked out. And because the Republicans walked out, a number of them didn't participate. They didn't have quorums to have votes, so all the legislation piled up at the Senate and didn't move, right? And when the Republicans returned at the last, I don't remember how many days of the session, the legislature ended up condensing bills together. And so what we had, the result of the session was a series of what they call omnibus bills, where what had been 8 separate bills became all condensed together into one housing bill or one climate change bill. So when you look at the memo that I put together of the bills, there are a number where I've said section 20 of this bill. You'll see that bill appear many times because it all got jammed into one bill number with 52 sections. So that's why there don't seem to be that many different bill numbers, because they were conjoined together for final adoption. So that's one thing that distinguished this last session. The second thing that distinguished this last session was a bill called House Bill 3414. And House Bill 3414 does a number of things, but one of the things that it does is it allows applicants for housing to obtain adjustments automatically if they can't comply with a particular standard. That was very controversial. And another thing that it does is that it allows local governments to do a one-time expansion of the urban growth boundary at its choice without going through any of the formalities of urban growth boundary expansions in order to accommodate additional housing. These two component parts led to opposition by a number of environmental advocates, a number of livability advocates, a number of sort of balanced planning advocates. And the result was that House Bill 3414 did not pass by one vote. It was one vote shy of passing. So this was the governor's proposed legislation that failed by one vote. And I'm telling you this long story because it is coming back. It will be before the legislature in this short session. And it has been rolled up in this bill, along with a number of other policies, has been rolled up into the Housing Policy Advocacy Committee work that the governor's office is working on. They have a committee of housing advocates that are working on it. House Bill 3414 is part of that bill, and it has potential because it allows an owner to essentially not comply with with almost any design standard or development standard. So we're talking about setbacks, we're talking about building height, we're talking about lot coverage, we're talking about floor area ratios, we're talking about windows, we're talking about siding, we're talking about sort of the full range. You can get up to 10, an owner can get up to 10 adjustments. And it's not entirely clear how you count adjustments, but presumably that will come out, but you can get up to 10. And the reason why I worked hard to oppose it myself personally was because it sort of usurps the process that local governments go through to ensure suitable design, compatible design. It doesn't take into account historic preservation resources. It does not allow adjustments for natural resources, so riparian resources, steep slopes are still protected, so you don't have safety concerns, but I had some historic preservation concerns. And the other thing about it that I think is kind of troubling for local governments is that in order to qualify for an adjustment, it's any housing. It's not affordable housing, or it's not constrained to low-income housing. It's any housing. So it doesn't matter if the owner who wants an adjustment is going to build a second home on the beach or needs the additional height to put a penthouse on the top of a big building in downtown Portland, they get it. It doesn't matter what type of housing we're talking about. You don't, in the bill, the applicant has to state that the reason for the adjustment is because it will increase the cost of development, or that it will result in low-income housing, but the owner doesn't have to commit to that. There's no ability in the bill for the city to require some form of proof. It is just a statement, and once the statement is made, the adjustment goes through. And it has a very constrained appeal right. No interested parties can appeal, that it's just between the applicant and the city. So this is an important piece because, one, I think it shows the commitment that the governor's office and many people in the legislature have for the construction of housing. They have identified the need to construct 141,000? 140,000 needed housing units and over 440 units in the next 20 years. So they are nose to the grindstone, going to identify what are the barriers to the production of housing, and they're gonna make it happen. And so what you see in all of the legislation from the last session, and I think what we'll see in the upcoming session, is this continual effort to try to figure out how to get more housing, whatever it takes to get more housing, because we are in such a we are in desperate need of supply. And the analysis is not constrained to affordable housing, low-income housing, special needs housing. It is every type of housing, from soup to nuts. So that is House Bill 3414, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what the other recommendations are in the Housing Advisory Council's recommendations, but I think that sets the framework. Is there something else on that slide I should mention?
No, I guess just to talk a little bit about the Housing Production Advisory Council. That was something that the governor established as basically on our first day in office. And so they formed up their council, and then they set about coming up with a framework, and then for how they were going to make decisions. And at the moment, they have working groups, and I'll go into that a little bit later, that are kind of informing this production strategy. And the goal is for this council to put together a strategy that would go to the governor's office by the end of this year, so that they can be ready for the short session. And one of the things I'll kind of interject is that since we gave this presentation, the governor's office has been making some clarifications on some pieces of 3414, and that adjustment piece, one of the clarifications is that for Oregon City and cities that are in the metro area, those adjustments will only apply to developments that are 20 dwelling units per acre. So for us, that's our R2 and our higher density areas. If it can still apply to single family residential, but they'd have to be, I think they did a calculation that it would be like 1 unit per 2,000 square feet, right? So if you had like a 2,000 square foot lot and you had a unit, then it might qualify. But so they're trying to put some kind of density standards around who can apply for those adjustments. So anyway, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Is now the time for questions on this slide, or should we wait until later?
Sure, yeah, you can ask questions as we go along.
You said one-time UGB. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So when you said one-time UGB expansion, what exactly does that mean?
Yeah.
Is it just one time and we're going to add 1,000 acres? What is that?
I think we might cover that a little bit later, but
Okay.
it's outside of the normal urban growth report that Metro does. So like, we're getting ready to go into that session right now. I shouldn't say session, but that period of review, or Metro will do this for us anyway, because we're in the Metro boundary. They do this urban growth report and say there's enough land or there isn't enough land. And if there isn't enough land, they recommend that there's UGB expansion. And so with this bill, it would give an individual city the ability, I think, we might have to go through Metro for us, but it would give the ability to, outside of the normal cycle, request for this urban growth boundary expansion.
But is it by an applicant, say?
No, it would have to be by a jurisdiction, so by a city, yeah.
So the city would say, we're going to expand our UGB boundary, blah, blah, blah. And it's
Yeah.
a one-time thing.
Right.
You can do it one time.
And it has to, the thresholds have to do with the size of the city, and I don't remember exactly what they are, but it's something like if you're a city of more than 10,000, you can decide that you want to add 20 acres one time. You get a one-time shot, but it would be initiated by the city, but you don't have to go through a needs analysis or the location analysis. And then if you're a bigger city, I think you can get 50 acres. But but for the metro region, it would have to go through metro. And because metro has urban reserves, I suspect that that would be how metro would do it.
Well, that was my question, is would it come out of urban reserves?
I think that that's what they're going, I think that's where they will direct it, for the metro area.
Okay, I got a question about that. Would it have to be a connected parcel? Or
Yes.
could it be a dot off to the side?
Yes, it would have to be connected because annexed land does have to be connected.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay. Did I go too far? I think we're.
Can I ask another question before we move on?
Yeah,
Okay. So on the House Bill 3414, it didn't pass, but they're trying to bring it back as something else. You said that the applicant can, they got up to 10 design adjustments, and the only rationale that they have to present is that I can make this more affordable, but it has to be this design, and we can't really judge if that's realistic or not. Could someone design a
in the
three-car garage?
the bill language provides that the applicant must state
State.
that the adjustment is needed to expedite the production of housing. They only have to state it. They don't have to produce any evidence to support it. And there are very constrained appeal rights in the bill, and you can't challenge an applicant with respect to that statement.
Okay. So somebody just wanted to design a garage with a front door next to it, and that's all you see from the street, but that's what they want, we can't say no.
Well, I think it would depend on what adjustments were necessary to do that, but that's the idea, is that if an applicant can bring a house that somebody can live in online by just having a garage and a door right next to it, and it's made entirely of corrugated steel and it has no windows, if it complies with the building code, then that's okay.
Okay, it's like a container house would work?
We'd have to go through all the elements of a container
as
house,
it's-
but
yeah.
sure, yes.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a container house manufacturer in Oregon City, right? Okay, so House Bill 2001?
Yeah.
Is that me?
Yeah, I think the first few slides.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so you may recall, so the title House Bill 2001, every legislative session, it feels like House Bill 2001 becomes a land use bill, and so it's very confusing. So middle housing, when we got rid of single family zoning and had middle housing, that was passed in the 2021 legislative session called House Bill 2001. Now, in 2023 session, we have another House Bill 2001 that doesn't have anything to do with middle housing, but it still has to do with housing. So we need to figure out a rule that puts land use off getting the number House Bill 2001, because it's just too confusing at this point. But the 2023 House Bill 2001 deals with what we call the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. And I know when I've talked to you all before about statewide goal 10. Statewide goal 10, land use goal 10 is a housing goal. And it says that local governments have to go and inventory their supply of land. They have to look at what their population growth projections are, and then they have to determine if they have enough land, given the existing zoning, to accommodate houses in those areas, those vacant or underdeveloped areas. That's what Goal 10 says. That's what Goal 10 has said for a long time. And so all the local government has to do is they have to make sure that the land and the zoning are available for housing, not that housing actually gets produced. And what we have in House Bill 2001 is a structure of a program that requires that local governments actually produce the housing. Not actually build it, but actually track the reasons why it is not getting built and changing things when housing is not getting built. So this scheme, this housing needs analysis is a framework for local governments proving up how many houses are built in a year, what the prices are of those houses, who they're available for, tracking manufactured housing, tracking low-income housing, tracking vacancy rates. And every year, cities are going to have to prove up to the Department of Land Conservation and Development how many units they have produced. Not owned and produced, but they have collectively facilitated production of. And so what's going to happen in this framework that House Bill 2001 sets out is that the Department of Land Conservation and Development Commission and the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department is going to work with the state to create housing production targets for cities greater than 10,000 people. So this is going to be a dashboard that's going to come out for every city, and it's going to say, you, Oregon City, have to produce this many affordable housing units, this many low income, this many mid income, this many high income. And then Oregon City is going to have to prove up every year that they're making progress. And so, Commissioner LaSalle.
Is there a definition of low-income housing?
Yes. There are multiple definitions, and it has to do with median income. I'm using the word low income and affordable housing very generically for purposes of our conversation, but they are quite detailed and they are broken down. There's homeless housing, so temporary housing. Then there's low-income housing that is for people who have, like, worker housing. So there's a lot of different classifications in all of that. So this dashboard that's going to come out, we believe our Oregon City's housing production targets are going to be put up in concert with Metro. And it's not clear to me if those are going to be region-wide, if it's going to be sort of Clackamas County, or if it's going to be down to the city for the metro area, just because there's so much overlap with cities. But this program is going to roll out. This is, again, the bill that creates the framework for that. And I think over the next 2 to 5 years, we're going to know more about it. I think the plan is that it will all be in place in the next 5 years.
Right. Yeah, and then, so we will have to adopt a housing needs analysis, which we did in 21, just a couple of years ago. But the difference is that new housing needs analysis will have to have ways that we're incentivizing, basically, the production of housing. So that's how that's how the state will track if we're complying with the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, which you're going to hear that called the ONA. So if you hear that term out there, ONA, that means Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. I think what will happen is Metro will have a certain number allocated to the region, and then kind of what they do now. They already go through and say, you're gonna, each city, this is kind of what you will be expecting. That's how we got the number for our last housing needs analysis of what we needed to plan for. Okay, all right, so, yeah, talking about incentives,
We have another question?
sure.
So you're going to require cities, everything from financial incentives to maybe SDC waivers to design things, and cities are going to have to come up with it without any money. I mean, with whatever the tools in their toolbox.
That's correct, yeah, whatever tools are in their toolbox. And I think that's probably where we'll get some help from Department of Land Conservation and Development, is what tools are available.
Yeah.
You know, what is that, what can that look like?
It's going to be, I think it's going to be it will be a radical departure from the way we do things now. I think it'll be really good because it's really going to give us data that we don't have now in terms of how many units get produced and who they're available to and how long they sit on the market. And, you know, we don't have to do that now. So we've never, you know, that data isn't out there. And I think when we actually get hard data about what communities people are moving to and why they're moving to them, it's going to be interesting. Okay, other questions about House Bill 2001? Moving on. Okay, so the next series of bills are provisions that relates to specific elements of the zoning scheme that are intended to encourage more housing. So the first one is House Bill 2984, is intended to encourage the reuse of commercial buildings for housing. So this is the idea that you have a vacant commercial office building in a downtown somewhere and you convert it to housing. And that this was going to help that adaptive reuse effort happen by prohibiting local governments from requiring a conditional use permit or a zone change in order to put housing in a commercial zone. So what I'm saying is, in some cities, residential development is not allowed in a commercial zone. That is not the case in Oregon City. In Oregon City, residential development is allowed in every commercial zone except for the mixed-use employment, which is an industrial zone rather than a commercial zone. So already, residential is allowed outright in every commercial zone in Oregon City. So this authorization won't affect anything in Oregon City. What could change, though, is that as of January 1st, 2022, the city cannot impose any additional off-street parking requirements for residential conversions. So if you had an office building that didn't have very much parking and it was going to a more high-dense residential use, you couldn't require additional off-street parking obligations as part of that review. And it constrains the ability of the city to collect additional system development charges unless the city adopted a specific SDC conversion charge analysis before January 1st. And I understand that Public Works is working on that question. They're taking a look at the SDC charges that apply to conversions generally with respect to historic buildings and when they go from residential to office or vice versa. And so they're looking into that as a bigger picture piece, but they are also taking on this more specific component. Questions about internal conversions?
And these passed?
This passed, yes.
Are you going to do the church one next?
Am I going to do the church one?
Well, that wasn't there, what was the one? In your paper that you wrote us, there was an example of, let's say, a conditional use.
Oh, yes, well,
You're gonna go to
House
that?
Bill 3151, and we'll get to that one, we're not there yet.
Okay, another bill, all right.
Okay, so right now we're talking about all the ways that commercial zones are going to be opened up to housing, right? We're going to allow internal conversions of existing commercial structures for housing, and we're not going to charge SDCs or impose parking requirements on that. We're going to allow outright affordable and middle-income housing in commercial zones. That's House Bill 3395. Again, all housing is allowed in Oregon City, so this doesn't change anything for us, but in places where residential is not allowed in a commercial zone, it would have to be allowed. House Bill, oh, no, 3395. No, emergency shelter Okay. You all may remember that in the 2021 session, the legislature passed a bill that that allowed essentially outright emergency shelter siting. You remember that from 2021? And that bill was slated to sunset. It would have expired in 2023, July 2023. And so Section 7 of the Omnibus Housing Bill extended the deadline, the sunsetting deadline of the emergency shelter siting authorization until such time as the homeless population in the state is less than 0.18%. And so we're now in a situation where the authorization for emergency shelter siting just will probably go on in perpetuity. The other thing that this amendment provides is that it says that this siting can happen with a hearing. There was confusion before about whether or not there needed to be or could be a public hearing to consider the emergency shelter siting. And now the amendment says that it can include a hearing. But again, the criteria upon which the city can deny it are only building code, health, safety related issues, not other issues. So it calls into question sort of what would be the value of a hearing. It's sort of, might just pour salt and, it just might not be, and the bill now the legislation now provides for recovery of attorney's fees by a person who challenges it. So again, would providing a public hearing indicate a potential right of appeal that it really is a false hope for people? So that is where we are with shelter applicants. 3395, is that single room occupancies, right? Okay, so the legislation also changed that local governments have to allow for single room occupancies, and single room occupancies are rented bedrooms, where you have a single house that has one kitchen and multiple bedrooms, and you rent out a bedroom. Oregon City does not regulate housing based on the familial relationship of the parties. So again, this will not have any effect in Oregon City, because right now you can rent out a room to whoever you want.
Ms. Richter, 3151, that's what you're just talking about?
No, I was just talking about section 17 of 3395.
Okay, sorry. I'm still ahead of you, sorry.
So now we're on manufactured dwelling parks?
Yeah.
Are we on the right slide?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, okay, so again, we've got these special categories of housing that we're trying to make more available for use, right? Remove the barriers to the provision of these types of low-income and much needed housing types. And so 3151 expands the existing mandate to allow affordable housing units without a zone change to include manufactured dwelling parks that are owned by nonprofit cooperative in commercial zones or on lands that allow for religious uses. So I think that where this goes is a church renting out their parking lot for manufactured housing, I think is what this is directed to allow. In Oregon City, religious uses are conditionally allowed in residential zones, but are not allowed outright. They are only allowed outright. Churches are only allowed outright in commercial zones. So where we would have this circumstance in Oregon City would be on a commercially zoned property owned by a church where they could then convert their parking lot to a manufactured home park or structure. And so it would not allow waiver of the city's conditional use criteria in a single-family residential zone.
So a church in a residential zone that with a large parking lot, a church in a residential area with a conditional use permit cannot put manufactured structures on their parking lot Okay, thank
without getting a conditional use permit to do that.
Okay, thanks.
I've got a related question.
Yeah.
You said something a minute ago that kind of sparked. So with LUBA appeals, is there anything in this latest legislation that talks about LUBA appeals and attorney fees for LUBA appeals? Have they addressed that question?
Right now, there are specific provisions for recovery of attorney's fees if it's an affordable housing project. And that has been the law for a couple of years, but they have not expanded that further.
Only for affordable.
Only for affordable. And the emergency shelter siting. If you challenge an emergency shelter siting decision, there's attorney fee recoveries.
Right.
But they haven't expanded that further. With respect to LUBA, the one thing they did change is how the 120-day deadline is calculated. Right now, the 120-day deadline does not include the period that it takes the city to draft findings. In other words, the city makes an oral decision and then it writes up the decision and then brings it back for adoption. That findings drafting period is not part of the 120 days. And the rule doesn't say how long that findings drafting period can be. Now, one of the amendments from this last session says that with its respect to housing, it can only be 7 days. And what is interesting about that is that part of the needed housing analysis, if a local government is intent on denying an application, they have to give an applicant an opportunity to submit conditions that would allow for approval of the application. Well, presumably an applicant's not going to know that they're going to be denied until the city council makes a tentative decision of denial, right? So that puts the local government in a situation where they've got to, on one hand, negotiate with an applicant about conditions that lead to approval, and at the same time scramble to have findings written in 7 days. So that's going to put a lot of work on people like me and Aquila to make that all happen in a very narrow window. What's next on our list?
Property tax.
Okay, a couple of the stragglers. There's a provision that allows cities and counties to adopt a 5-year property tax exemption for newly constructed accessory dwelling units or the conversion of existing single-family structures to a duplex, triplex, or fourplex. This is a permissive authorization, and I haven't heard of what jurisdiction is scrambling to do this, but it's an opportunity for those that are interested. It's middle housing.
So any middle housing, a city could elect to make it tax exempt,
Correct.
but they have to elect to do that, it's not a mandatory thing.
They have to elect to do it.
And it has to be owner occupied.
Oh, right, it has to be owner occupied, so you can't do it for short-term rentals. With respect to subdivision, more questions? Okay. With respect to subdivision improvements, you know that it's often the case that once a developer gets a subdivision approval, then they have to go put in the subdivision improvements before they can get their final plat. And local governments require a bond or sometimes an irrevocable letter of credit in order to ensure the completion of public improvements, right? And then they'll record the plat early if you've posted a bond that ensures the public improvements will be made. There's a special rule that relates to allowing public housing providers to rely on letters of funding from their investors as that guarantee, because public housing providers don't borrow money from don't have the money to post bonds and don't borrow money to get in irrevocable letters of credit. And so they can't comply with the black letter of the code with respect to public guarantees for public improvements. And so this is a special provision that allows them to rely on letters from their investors as that guarantee. And then I talked about the 120-day limit rule change for the 7 days. Okay, please.
On what we're reviewing tonight, this is sort of like a summary of all the, shall we say, the most important points of all the legislation?
This is a summary of the land use related legislation. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the most important. It's just the land use planning related.
Yeah. Can we say that everything that you're presenting tonight is all of the land use related items? Okay, great.
Directly land use planning related. There are lots of things that have to do with tenancy and taxation and that I'm not covering because it doesn't relate to, I think, our role as local government with respect to zoning regulation.
Got it.
And the purpose of this exercise was to identify where we needed to change the code and where we needed to be aware of places we may have to grant exceptions, even where a code isn't updated yet. You know, grant, I don't mean exceptions to the code, I mean like where the law has changed and preempts our code, and we haven't caught up yet to change our code.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, and then finally, there were a couple of omnibus climate change related bills that are worthy of mention. I think that you all are probably familiar with the climate friendly and equitable communities rules. Those are the rules that DLCD promulgated, or LCDC promulgated a year or 2 now, 2 years now? That are intended to address climate change, and they constrain local government's ability to require off-street parking and create climate-friendly zones that incentivize equitable housing objectives, as well as, transit support, extra transit supportive areas, extra mixed use areas. So these were rules that LCDC promulgated. They were challenged by a number of cities, including Oregon City. That case is pending at the Court of Appeals. Part of the state's commitment to local governments has always been, I think, to help local governments implement. The issue with a lot of these big legislative schemes or administrative schemes is that they require a lot of work on local governments to implement them and make our codes fit with the requirements. And so one of the big concerns about the climate-friendly rules is the time it will take to revise our transportation system plan and our zoning and our regulations to get us from the rules on the paper to the zoning on the ground. And so part of this last session, the legislature appropriated $2.6 million to help local governments come into compliance. So, caveat, or not a caveat, but an additional thing you should probably know is that LCDC is working on amendments to those rules right now, and whether or not they're going to go far enough to address the local government's concerns, we don't know yet, but there are changes in the works with respect to that. Finally, the part of another climate-focused bill, there is a grant money that is going out to encourage protection of urban tree canopies. And DLCD is going to implement this program, and so it will be something that I think maybe PRAC or the Natural NRC will maybe follow up with the planning staff about getting some grant money for some urban tree protection or additional urban tree protection standards. So, questions about climate-related bills?
So is it for housing, or it's for the whole city, for commercial areas and trees and,
It's citywide. This is
citywide. It's not just a housing.
This is a climate-focused bill, so this is about legislation to protect trees.
Oh,
Commissioner Laws has just shown up, and it's only a work session tonight. There is no regular meeting. We've got about 5 minutes to go.
Okay, all right, so the second part of the presentation then is about some of the comments that we submitted to the governor's policy advisory committee. So I talked about this a little bit in the beginning of the presentation, but the Housing Policy Advisory Committee, HPAC, was established through this executive order at the beginning of the year, and one of their main goals, one of their charges, is to come up with a production strategy that would result in 36,000 homes built per year. That was the number that they came up with. So they started meeting in March and developed a framework plan, and they came up with 5 different work groups. One's called availability of land. There's a land development permit application process, codes and design, workforce shortages, and financing. Those are all the work groups that are kind of putting thought behind this. And they make recommendations to HPAC, who will eventually put together a package for the governor. And they're wanting to see that go into the 2024 short session. And so in the meantime, the governor's office has reached out to cities, and they also participate with the League of Oregon Cities, and there's a group called the Oregon City Planning Directors Association, and they're asking for feedback on on this framework plan. And so one of the areas that we started looking at are our urban growth expansion areas. There we go, okay. And the areas that we've added or have been added to our city, over the last couple of decades that have really had slow development and slow growth. And part of that has to do with infrastructure and the cost to get infrastructure to these areas. So we kind of focused on the finance recommendations. And so what we communicated back to the governor's office is that, we've got areas of the city that are really hilly with a lot of steep slopes and can be really difficult to serve with water and sewer and transportation. And then part of our transportation system really relies on state facilities, ODOT-run facilities, and either having to use those as arterials or cross those to get across town. And so there's a lot of congestion that's around those facilities. And so what we've seen with reduced funding sources from federal and state government and just not a lot of funding sources in the cities is that a higher reliance on system development charges to help offset some of the capacity impacts. And so that's kind of where some of this balance comes in, is that the SDCs are really necessary to keep our infrastructure capacity, but there's a cost to that. And there's some estimates that I think we've heard over the years, many years from developers, that it can add like 25% to the cost of a home. So we were really asking for state infrastructure investments that could help offset that. And so our comments acknowledge that publicly funded infrastructure should also be targeted at not just market rate, but types of housing that the market won't readily develop, like veterans housing or housing for moderate and low income households. So the other piece that we wanted to acknowledge in our comments is that the land availability should really be based on our local needs. So rather than this large, what we were talking about earlier with this large, housing, Oregon Housing Needs Assessment, this ONA, and just kind of distributing numbers, is that it really needs to be based on what our local needs are, and that we should be able to customize what our supply of housing looks like. So we wanted to make the point that the housing legislation should not be a one-size-fits-all, and that local communities should be able to plan for what their communities and individual needs are. And then the other point that we wanted to make is that if we can preserve housing, if we can preserve existing housing stock, but also preservation in the terms of historic preservation, that's another way of ensuring that there's some kind of naturally occurring, more affordable housing, and that there shouldn't be incentives, there shouldn't be any financial incentives to tear down existing housing, because that preservation can create that kind of naturally occurring affordable housing. So, like I mentioned, we
have a question from
Oh, yeah,
Commissioner
sure.
Lasalle.
The way I understand it, we are asking for funding from the state to help with our infrastructure costs.
So, in a not that direct of a way, what we're asking the state to do is to focus their housing production efforts on how they can provide infrastructure funding, whether that's through grants or forgivable loans or whatever mechanism. So we're not actually asking for any specific amount of funding for infrastructure, but we're saying, state, when you put together this production strategy, you need to really focus on the financing part of it.
And would that then allow us to reduce or eliminate some of the SDCs to make it easier for the developers?
Yes, I think what it would do is create ways for us to lower some SDCs for the eventual homeowners, because the developers are going to pass that charge on. And what we're wanting to do is not have it across the board so that, your 5,000 square foot home also gets a SDC reduction, but that your lower and moderate income homes, where it really creates a large increase on the price, that kind of affordability range can have a lower cost. That would be the purpose, one of the purposes, but the other purpose is just supply in general. We can't really partner with developers to get the supply in general because of the cost of infrastructure.
Then how would you be assured that the developer would pass those reduction of those costs on to a net reduction of the housing?
Yeah, it's a really good question and a good point. We've talked about that quite a bit, and it would have to be through some type of covenant. There'd have to be some type of mechanism to assure that that's what happened, that's what the outcome was. Yeah.
I've got a question. Do we know if HB 3414 has anything in there about providing funding to cities for
I think it does.
system development fees? Is it in there as a discussion yet, or?
Was that,
3414 doesn't have anything about infrastructure. The HPAC comments do.
right.
But House Bill 3414 does not have anything about infrastructure incentives.
Nothing about SDCPs? Yeah, okay, just curious.
Can I add something to that? It's a question. Right now, the city doesn't, we don't look at one property and say, well, this is a pretty simple property. Infrastructure connecting this property to the city is going to be much easier, and we charge that developer less. And then someone else has a much more difficult one, so we're going to charge him triple. Our SDCs are based on number of units. It's a certain charge per unit. It's not determined by how horrible the property is to connect to. So technically, the expensive properties are making the cheaper properties more expensive, right? Because we're taking the most expensive ones and we're kind of making a level playing field by charging everyone the same SDCs. So by the more complex scenarios are making it more expensive for the simplest.
Well,
properties.
I think that the improvement money that the state is talking about financing are pump stations and main lines that would be conditions of development in these urban growth boundary expansion areas. That's different than SDCs, right? SDCs are more diffuse in their assessment and the methodology about sort of what the overall sewer demand is for one house that is generally the same depending on,
Yeah.
So your scenario of it's more difficult or it's easier, these utilities that are difficult to extend or can be attributed to one particular development are separate conditions of approval that are distinct from SDCs.
Right. So I think an example may be if you have a single family home on a vacant lot in the middle of Oregon City and there's, a sewer and water line going down the middle of the street, you still have to pay the SDC, and you can easily connect up with the lateral. But if you're talking about some property in South End concept plan, and there isn't the main line for sewer and water, you pay the, single-family home SDC, and now the developer also has to pay to extend that main line. So that's what ends up costing, being more expensive. But I don't know that that necessarily makes the home, the infill lot more expensive.
But, I mean, let's say the South End area, I don't know if it's downhill or not, but if the entire South End concept plan needed a pump station, just to function, the developer wouldn't have to pay for the pump station. That'd be on the city.
They would.
Pay for the pump station.
Right.
Today they do.
They would,
Right.
but they would get reimbursement from the other houses when they come online.
Okay.
So there's a reimbursement district that's created out of all the houses, and when those houses come online, they pay the developer who built the pump station for their share of the cost of the pump station. But it's that initial expense
Right.
that is significant.
Yeah.
And that's what these recommendations are trying to get at. And where we directed our comments was not, was in parts pump stations and stuff like that, but it was
Yeah.
really transportation, right? The challenge in Oregon City is that the main lines in Oregon City are highways. And Oregon City has a lot of pass-through traffic. And so when highways have to be upgraded, it falls on developers to upgrade them, but their proportionate share to that highway is 1% of the total traffic that highway conveys. So the city gets a 1% contribution for that development, but that doesn't pay to build new lanes or build new streetlights or, and so, so the city collects 1% from this developer, 1% from this developer, and maybe gets 5% cobbled together over a 15-year period. But 50% of the traffic passing through is from outside Clackamas County, and those users never pay. Those new houses out in unincorporated Clackamas County don't pay an SDC to Oregon City for the use of the highways that come
Right.
through.
Yeah.
And so there's a free rider problem with respect to the city's transportation improvement scheme that really, it ought to be ODOT who pays for everybody, or Clackamas County and Oregon City and ODOT start collecting from a broader pool because there's more users.
Now, would this help, if there was some money that came available, would it help in a situation like the Thimble Creek concept plan where we're really restricted by Beaver Creek Road as it sits, but there's no development to fund building out the road?
Yes. And, we've got roads that are geologically and challenged, right? I mean, they're going to be they're going to be expensive to build. They're going to take some engineering, and they're going to take some upfront, funding for it to really take off. And that's sort of what staff's feeling is part of the reason why these areas haven't developed.
Yeah, it's the chicken and the egg.
They've been in the urban growth boundary since 2007 or two. And they're not developed yet. And, so that's what we're trying to offer is let's develop these lands before expanding the urban growth boundary into farmland or into more environmentally precarious places. Let's crack the nut on these areas that have been in the urban growth boundary for a long time.
Okay, thank you.
So, and that was really the focus of our comments is, so in this policy, in this production framework, focus on the finance piece of it. The other pieces that I had read in terms of recommendations just seem to add more bureaucracy, and we're not going to actually directly impact production like focusing on finance would. So just, I wanted to say this and throw this in that, so the governor's office was responsive to feedback, with caveat that a little bit, in that they're engaging with us, is what I should say. They're not necessarily like changing everything based on what we've said, but they're listening and they're engaging with cities. So their senior policy advisor has been reaching out to cities, including us, and also working with, there's a group that meets every other week, the League of Oregon Cities and the Oregon City Planning Directors Association. So that the policy advisors meeting with that group and getting feedback. And so we've been given a chance to look at the draft framework and the clarifications that are being made, and provide feedback on that. So I just did want to make that mention that they are trying to get our input. And I'd say what's interesting is that the cities that participate in some of these roundtable discussions, we're not all in the same boat, right? We've got different needs and different desires, and there's some cities that are ready to take on building, acquiring land and building housing. And, we're not there, but other cities are ready to do that. So there's just kind of a broad variety of what is going to work for everyone, so. I don't think that we have funding I haven't heard our city commission talk about acquiring land and actually building and then operating low-income housing. Yeah.
You're saying there's cities out there in Oregon that are
They're looking at it, yeah.
willing to do that?
Yeah. Yeah, they're willing to take it
Well,
on.
it sounds like you're going to be pretty busy keeping us in line on how we're thinking and our decision-making.
Right. Yeah, that's why we thought it would be a good time to just set the table for what may be coming. And I think that is it. So, yeah, happy to answer any more questions or take any more discussion, but.
Well, I asked my questions as we went. Are there any other questions? Yes. Okay.
Thank you very much.
That's it.
It always helps to hear you speak versus me reading the paper before the meeting. Whoa, I guess we're done.
Well, that's interesting.
Another quarter.
Woo!
Cool.
At least the computer screens are,
We still have screens.
Weird.
there we go.
Okay.
There was no movement. All right.
Somebody's trying to tell us something.
I think so. Well,
Halloween.
no, I don't know. That didn't make any sense. All right. No questions on that. That's the only thing I see on our agenda. Any communications other than what we've already discussed?
We do have an item scheduled for November 13th, and that will be a regular meeting, our 7 o'clock start time, and we thought that was going to come tonight. That's the legislative amendment that'll be coming before you on November 13th, so.
Okay.
And I think that's all for communications.
All right. Thank you. Anything from any of the commissioners? Okay, got something from Commissioner Laws.
Okay, so we're looking at this in the future. We were talking about hills and other things. One thing that's been kind of a alert to me in terms, and I've gotten feedback from other residents, is like if you're going down the hill, Malala, is the height. That we have a view basically going downhill. And it concerns me in the future with infill that we'll lose that view. So are we looking at something like that in the future, of maybe having a type of variance in certain areas where there's a view, possibly? Or something to consider?
No, I don't have that on any work plan. I haven't heard that from the city commission. So I think if that's something that you'd like to have the planning commission discuss, I can add that to an agenda item. If the rest of the planning commission would like to talk about that, I can add that onto a future agenda, and we can discuss it more, and we can kind of figure out where you might want to go from there.
And the other thing to consider as well is we look at Malala Avenue in terms of the traffic. In the future, obviously, it would be more ideal to have commerce on the bottom and, dwellings on the top. And back in 2019, that was a discussion back when, and we haven't discussed that more recently because it'd be nice to have more businesses, especially along Malala Avenue, that is in walking distance for communities to be able to buy things they need or, have more commerce rather than, having businesses involved as well than just building, and having no businesses support that.
When you say commerce on bottom, you mean like some kind of retail or commercial on the first floor? Okay. Yeah, mixed use. And Malala is all, the zoning along Malala is mixed use corridor. So you might be thinking of more design or development standards that would require what you're talking about.
The big thing to see is that, I'm looking at, because I'm in the neighborhood association as well, is a lot of Malala is owned by California firms, and they're sitting on those properties, and they're not moving, and they look not very appealing right now. So long term, it'd be great to have some innovation on Malala Avenue. It would draw more people to the area. It would create more ideal livability for residents, and then there'd be things in walking distance, so we wouldn't necessarily have to get in our cars as much.
Okay.
Okay, I do have one thing to talk about. It's strange, but those are most of the things I talk about. Question for, this is for Aquila and Carrie together. The question was brought up on social media. Does the city have the power to investigate alternative energy? Let's say, for example, difficult to build land like the Rossman landfill where it's impossible. I'm not saying it is impossible to build on it. It's expensive. And let's say it just doesn't seem feasible that anything will happen. Could the city look into a large solar farm, for example, something to put on there? Does the city have the authority to look into things like that? Or would it have to stay private?
So I think to that last part of what you said, I think if the city owns the land, that they could look at doing something like that. Is that what your question is?
Right, let's say the land is
Does it
just too
have to-
difficult and the value isn't there for anybody to develop. Could the city have the power to buy the land and look into a solar farm?
I'm going to say yes. Power means the
City would have to-
finances to purchase it, yeah.
Because a lot of times those solar farms you can get yourself into a lease where you really don't pay much. You just get a payment and someone else kind of does the investing. I don't know if the city would want to be in a partnership like that. I know no companies, I'm not representing anyone, but it's just questions that were asked, and I just wanted to kind of ask those questions here. Is that something the planning commission could bring up to the city commission if the planning commission chose to? And if the planning commission sees no value in it, then it wouldn't go any further than here, but.
Well, I think that the planning commission used to have priorities for the year that it would set. And if that were something that was a priority for the planning commission, I think, they would have like 2 or 3 things that were priorities, and they were sort of longer term goals. It's hard for me to see the connection between what you're talking about and land use planning in terms of regulations. It seems like what you're talking about is more sort of a governance policy question. Should Oregon City buy a piece of land in order to get it developed because it's sitting vacant and that's bad for Oregon City? That is a sort of bigger policy question than land. That doesn't have anything to do with land use regulation. But it could certainly be part of a agenda if that were something that was of interest to the commission, because you see an area that's not developing the way you'd like to see it, and you think one of the contributing factors to that is a piece that, the city ought to buy and make it into this. So.
Just a thought that I'll throw out there. So the Natural Resource Committee, when they met last week or 2 weeks ago, at their last meeting, started talking about different pieces of what could be in a climate action plan. And so they may talk about that more at some of their their upcoming meetings, and they may eventually put together some ideas that they would then take to the city commission. And so I'm wondering if maybe there's an opportunity for collaboration, or if you wanted to attend one of those NRC meetings and start talking about some of your ideas. And there could be some crossover between NRC and the Planning Commission. I agree with Carrie that I don't know that there's necessarily a land use connection. But my advice to you as a board, as a committee, would be if this is something you want to take up, I can put it on an agenda. If there's some agreement that you want to discuss this, I can put it on an agenda. You can discuss it, talk about how you might present it, and then you could bring it forward at a city commission hearing of something that the planning commission talked about that you wanted to share with the city commission. That would be my suggestion for how to move something like that forward.
Go ahead.
If that is the case and we decide to discuss this, I think it would be nice to have a list of things and almost do a work session to prioritize some things, but not just, I would say to do that instead of just one at a time here and there. So maybe after the first of the year, new people will be on board again, and we could make some goals and objectives long-term, like Chair Schlagenhofer was suggesting.
That sounds great. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, to have an agenda as a planning commission of what we would like to discuss with the city commission in general, and things related to land use and planning in the city.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make a comment about your idea, and I mean, I think I'm correct in that, while the city already owns several parcels of land that they could do that with, right? They could decide to do that today. And they could use urban renewal. I believe they could use urban renewal funds to maybe pay for that. I don't know if that's correct, but
I'm not sure the current status of urban renewal.
yeah, right. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff to think about when you think about a piece of land that, like the landfill property, for example,
I mean, because the current owner could also apply for something like that too.
Yeah, that's right.
And they're not pursuing it, which is usually a reason. Commissioner Lawson.
The last thing I was thinking of too, the neighborhoods have experienced a lot of infill in terms of developers, to their defense, are trying to get things through as affordable as possible. If there wasn't a motivation to make it more aesthetically pleasing in terms of making decisions, especially that would match our city a little bit more, some more incentives in some way. I don't know exactly what that would look like yet. And the other thing would be is to plant more native trees in these developments, not just and then, not small trees like pin oaks all the time, like something a little bit bigger, and have some more initiatives, since we're talking about our tree canopy anyways, is to look at that as promoting somehow developers to plant some big trees that are native to Oregon.
Okay. Well, you all have given me some good ideas where I can kind of start an agenda for you, and I like that idea. If you're all in agreement that we can put together kind of a work plan for that first part of the year, and work through what you want to discuss and what you want to take forward to the city commission.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Sounds good.
Put that on the calendar.
I've just got one last question related to my own destiny. I think it's January that I'm retiring from the Planning Commission. What is the protocol for what if I wanted to stay?
So you're right, your term is up at the end of this year, and you just have to go online. I think we sent out emails. There's an online place where you need to fill out an application, and we're still in October, so you have plenty of time to do that. And with one of the more recent elections, the charter changed, and now you would get interviewed by the entire city commission, and then they would make their decision.
Are there any restrictions to not doing another term?
I don't know how many terms you've served, but there is a restriction to 8 years, 8 consecutive years.
Okay. Yeah.
So have you, is this your first term?
Yes,
or-
first one.
Okay, yeah. So you can serve as a
So
second
I just want to
four-year
basically
term.
go through the application process.
Yeah.
Same as I did before.
Exactly,
Okay.
yeah.
Got it.
Well, it may not be exactly the same, but it's all online now.
Right.
Yeah.
I think the last time I reapplied, well, the first time I reapplied, the only time, I just reapplied. I had to go online and put all my information back in and just reapply.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I had to interview like everyone else. No, actually, I didn't have to interview exactly the same as chair, but even vice chair had to interview like everyone else. Yeah. All right, Commissioner LaSalle.
We were discussing about city-owned land, and I'm just curious, has the Grand Ronde tribe, are they required to, and are they pulling demolition permits on their land?
Yes. To both of those, they are required to, and they are pulling demolition permits.
All right,
I've got a follow-up comment on that. I was thinking about this earlier.
Mike. Mike.
Oh, sorry. Okay, great. Can you update us on what's happening with that property in terms of future planning, activities, anything coming down the pipe? Do we know what's happening there?
I don't have all of the details, but eventually they will apply to amend the master plan that was adopted, I don't remember when. I don't know if you remember when, but. A long time. Okay, a long time ago. So they will apply to amend that master plan. They have a staff planner, the Grand Ronde has a staff planner who's been working with Christina Robertson Gardner to kind of understand the master plan, the existing one. And so they're working through that, and eventually that would come to, I believe, to the Planning Commission for amendment. We thought they were going to have a pre-application in this past summer, and then we thought it was going to be this fall. And now we're thinking maybe we'll see something next spring. But they have their own set of kind of sign-offs they have to go through, but before they can make any application to us. So that's kind of the high level that I know about. There are more details, and I don't have them all stored in my brain.
Christina's kind of sort of working with them on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Could we get like a 15-minute presentation from Christina, kind of telling us what's happening at some point soon?
So I will talk to her. I don't know that it's entirely appropriate because it will be like a quasi-judicial hearing.
Right.
So,
Maybe after the pre-app, there could be some kind of.
well, no, I don't think so. I think I can bring you kind of this high level, here's what their schedule,
Sure.
here's what's going to, when you might
Yeah.
see something. But because it's that quasi-judicial piece, I don't know, we'll talk offline. I'll talk to Christina and see, but I'm not sure that it's actually appropriate to give any kind of update before
Yeah.
it's ready.
I mean, it's an extremely important property
Agreed.
in the city. I can
Agreed.
tell you, like, there probably isn't a week that goes by that someone doesn't say something to me about what's happening down there. It's like, nobody knows anything. You know, it's like, we're just kind of all sitting around waiting for something to happen, and
You-
nobody knows anything.
You can go to, the Grand Ron has a website for Tumwata Village, so they've renamed it to Tumwata Village. And there are some like conceptual, I think there's a website with some kind of conceptual ideas, so that's a way that you could direct somebody who's asking you questions, but,
Yeah.
yeah.
Can we assume at this point that the Riverwalk is off? It's not happening?
I don't think we can assume that.
We don't know anything about that?
I think that's-
Previously with Metro and everybody, that whole plan, is that still sort of in the works, or?
So what I can say about that, the partners that we're meeting about that have not been meeting. There's not really a partnership in terms of setting up meetings to talk about it anymore. But I don't know that we can assume there won't be a river walk.
Yeah,
I think there most likely will be something.
right.
What that turns into, I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We're adjourned.